Alejandro Castillo was, in essence, an architect of justice, a man who built his life upon the unshakable foundation of the law. Hailing from the dusty streets of Iztapalapa, he climbed the rungs of the Mexican judicial system with a fierce determination, believing that a lawyer's robe was an armor against the darkness that permeated his city. He did not see the law as a set of cold rules, but as a living organism, the only force capable of balancing the scales between power and vulnerability. His story, that of a man who rose through faith in justice, is a painful echo that resonates across many realities. If you who hear me now share this anguish, this search for a more just world, I ask you to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and please comment with where you're watching from. Your voice helps us continue. His office, in the beating heart of the luxurious Polanco neighborhood, was a sanctuary of glass and steel, a testament to his success. The walls were adorned not with extravagant art, but with commendations for his tireless pro bono cases. Alejandro was a name whispered with reverence in the courthouse halls, a methodical adversary and a passionate defender of the disadvantaged. For him, each case was more than a legal dispute, it was a moral battle. He spent sleepless nights immersed in stacks of documents, searching for the loophole, the hidden truth that would free an innocent person or condemn a guilty one. His faith in the E-D system was almost religious, a conviction that despite endemic corruption, the structure of the law, if wielded with integrity, would prevail over the rot that corroded society from within, ensuring that order would triumph over chaos. The true foundation of his world, however, was not in the penal codes or the Constitution, but in the smile of his wife, Sophia. She was an investigative journalist, possessing a courage that bordered on recklessness and eyes that saw through the most elaborate lies. Where Alejandro was calculated and methodical, Sophia was impetuous and driven by a visceral passion for the truth. Their apartment, bathed in a warm, vibrant light, was a refuge from the grey world they both fought against. It was there that discussions of political corruption mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of their laughter. Sophia was his true north, the constant reminder of why his fight mattered, the personification of the innocence and justice he had sworn to protect with his life and career. The shadow that loomed over them began as a whisper, a dangerous investigation that Sophia was conducting with implacable obstinance. She was unraveling a monumental scheme of public fund embezzlement, a complex web that connected the sadistic Los Cuervos cartel to prominent political figures, including the charismatic Senator Javier Montenegro. Alejandro, with his legal knowledge, helped her organize the evidence, transforming the raw material into an irrefutable indictment. He felt the danger emanating from that work, a coldness that not even the warmth of their love could dispel. He warned her, urged caution, but he knew the fire that consumed her. For Sophia, backing down was not an option. Exposing those men was more than a story. It was a moral duty to the silent victims of the system. Their last night together was painfully normal, a portrait of domesticity that would be seared into his memory like an open wound. They had dinner on the small balcony of their apartment, with the lights of Mexico City twinkling below like a sea of fallen stars. Sophia was exhausted, but her eyes shone with the proximity of victory. She had obtained the final piece of the puzzle, a testimony that directly linked Senator Montenegro to the cartel. Alejandro held her hand, feeling a mix of pride and a deep fear that chilled his bones. He made her promise to be careful, a promise they both knew was fragile in the world they lived in. That moment of peace, of quiet love, was the calm before the storm that would drown his world forever. The phone call came in the early hours of the next morning, a shrill sound that tore through the silence and Alejandro's future. The voice on the other end of the line was cold, bureaucratic, speaking of a car accident, of failed brakes. But Alejandro knew. He rushed to the scene, finding only twisted wreckage and the sinister glow of ambulance lights. The world that was once vibrant and full of color had now become a desaturated, cold landscape. In the morgue, under the fluorescent light that seemed to suck all life from the room, he saw Sophia's body. In that instant, the brilliant lawyer died, and something much darker began to awaken in his place, an entity forged in pain, and the certainty that this had been no accident, but a cruel and cowardly execution. Driven by an icy fury, Alejandro channeled his pain into the only arena he knew, the courtroom. He possessed copies of all of Sophia's evidence, a detailed dossier that was a ticking time bomb aimed at the heart of the city's corrupt elite. He entered the case not as a grieving widower, but as a relentless prosecutor, believing the strength of the evidence would be undeniable. However, with every step, he felt the system closing in on him. The evidence began to mysteriously disappear from police files. Sophia's key witness was found dead in her home, a staged suicide. The power of his enemies was an invisible cancer, with metastases in every institution he had once revered, and he was suffocating in the rot. The final blow came on the day of the trial. The judge, a man whose career had been built with the cartel's dirty money, barely glanced at the remaining evidence. With a subtle smile and a tone of disdain, he dismissed the case, citing a lack of conclusive evidence. In that moment, inside the cold marble hall that should have been a temple of justice, Alejandro Castillo shattered. The faith that had sustained him his entire life turned to ash. He looked at the cartel's lawyers, at the arrogance on their faces, and he understood. The law was not a shield for the innocent, it was a weapon for the powerful. And if the system could not deliver justice, he himself would become the sentence. In that deafening silence of the courtroom, the Justicar was born. Alejandro left the courthouse not as a defeated man, but as a ghost stripped of his own skin. He walked aimlessly through the streets of Mexico City, an automaton, amidst the chaotic flow of life and sound that now seemed a cruel mockery. The skyscrapers that once symbolized his aspirations now suffocated him, casting long, cold shadows that mirrored the void in his soul. The initial pain, sharp and piercing, had solidified into something denser and more dangerous, a glacial rage, a terrible clarity. He watched the people around him, living their lives, oblivious to the monster of corruption nesting beneath the city's surface. And he realized that justice was not blind. It was bought, and he no longer had the currency to pay for it. Returning to the apartment was a self-imposed torture. The space, once a sanctuary of love and partnership, was now a cold mausoleum, every object a painful echo of what was lost. The faint scent of Sophia's perfume still lingered in the bedroom air, a ghostly presence that stabbed him with every breath. He stood before the wall where she kept her investigation board, a collage of photos, newspaper clippings, and notes connected by red strings. It was a map of the rot that had consumed her. He traced the lines with his fingers, feeling the texture of the paper, the last physical trace of her crusade. That apartment was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, and the crime had not only been her murder, but the murder of hope itself. It was in the back of a closet, hidden under a pile of old books, that he found Sophia's true legacy. Not the copies he took to court, but her. Investigative journals, notebooks filled with her hurried handwriting, detailing secret meetings, bribes, threats, and the deepest, darkest connections between the Los Cuervos cartel and Senator Montenegro. They were raw notes, full of her frustrations, fears, and above all, her unwavering determination. There was the naked truth, without the filters of the legal process. It was a testament to her bravery and a direct indictment. Sophia hadn't just been collecting facts, she was mapping the anatomy of evil, and she had left him the scalpel to dissect it. There, in that sepulchral silence, with the journals open in his hands, Alejandro made his decision. The justice he sought would not be found in a courtroom, would not be granted by a corrupt judge. Sophia's justice, the truth for which she gave her life, would be won in the same dark alley where morality had been abandoned by his enemies. He would no longer plead for a verdict. He would be the verdict. At that moment, he made an oath over his wife's memory. He would become the predator that hunted the monsters hiding in plain sight. His life, from that instant on, would have a single, terrible purpose: to dismantle that network, piece by piece, name by name, until the blood debt was paid in full. The transformation was methodical, a controlled demolition of his former identity. In less than a week, Alejandro Castillo ceased to exist. He liquidated his bank accounts, converted his assets into cash and precious metals, and systematically erased his digital footprint. He sold his office and his apartment through proxies, becoming a ghost in the system he once dominated. With the resources, he acquired a new identity, a new face for the world. He moved into the shadows of Iztapalapa, the neighborhood that had seen him born, using his knowledge of the terrain to dissolve into the crowd. He was no longer a lawyer. He was becoming a weapon, forging himself with the precision of a jurist and the coldness of an executioner, preparing for the war to come. Alejandro's first weeks in the shadows of Iztapalapa were a fever of planning and rebirth. He set up his base of operations in an abandoned warehouse, a skeleton of concrete and rust that reeked of mold and despair, a perfect reflection of his inner state. The once bare walls were covered with Sophia's maps, organizational charts of corruption, photos of the targets, and timelines of their routines. He spent days and nights in front of monitors, immersed in the data stream from hacked security cameras and GPS trackers. The methodical lawyer had not died. He had merely changed his vocation. His mind, once used to build legal arguments, was now dedicated to architecting the deconstruction of lives, turning the law of probability and human error into his new and terrible jurisprudence. His first target was not a big fish, but a vital cog in the machine of impunity, the head of evidence custody at the police department, a man named Captain Diaz, who had conveniently lost Sophia's file. For a month, Alejandro studied him with monastic obsession. He learned Diaz's routine, his coffee stops, the mistress he visited on Thursdays, his gambling debt to dangerous loan sharks. He infiltrated his life like a virus, invisible and lethal. Every detail he discovered about the man's corrupt mediocrity fueled his cold fury. Diaz was not an ideological monster. He was just a petty official who had sold justice for a few thousand pesos, and for that his price would be paid with his life. The night of the execution was cold and damp. Alejandro waited for Diaz in his building's parking garage, his heart hammering against his ribs, a wild rhythm he didn't recognize. When the captain appeared, hesitation paralyzed him for a second. Sophia's image mixed with the frightened face of his victim. To kill was not an abstraction. It was a dirty, intimate, and irrevocable act. But the memory of the judge's smile in the courtroom spurred him on. He subdued Diaz, the fear in the man's eyes a mirror of his own lost humanity. The act itself was quick, clumsy, brutal. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream, filled only by the weight of what he had done. The line had been crossed. Before disappearing into the night, Alejandro executed the first part of his ritual. On Captain Diaz's lifeless chest, he left a perfect copy of Sophia's dossier, the same one the captain had sworn he had lost. It was his signature, his declaration of war. He was not just a murderer, he was a messenger of a stolen truth. He wanted them to know exactly why they were dying. He wanted the world to see the rot he was excising. That symbolic act was crucial, turning a murder into a sentence. He was rewriting the end of Sophia's story, using the blood of her enemies as ink, ensuring that the truth, however brutal, would finally come to light. Captain Diaz's death exploded in the media. Initially treated as a cartel settling of scores, The presence of the dossier changed the narrative. An independent blogger who had received an anonymous copy of the file published the full story, and the city began to whisper. The legend of the Justicar was born. Alejandro, hidden in his refuge, watched the news with a mixture of revulsion and grim satisfaction. He felt no joy, only the glacial void of vengeance. This was just the first name on his list, the first verse of an epic of retribution he was destined to write. The man he had, Ibn, was dead and buried, and in his place, a shadow with a relentless purpose now moved through the city. The task of hunting this new shadow fell to Detective Isabella Vega. Smart, stubborn, and one of the few incorruptible officers in a police force infested with corruption, she immediately dismissed the cartel theory. The execution was too precise, the message too clear. This wasn't about territory or drugs, it was about information. Vega felt a strange connection to the killer, a reluctant respect for his methodology. She delved into the old files, unearthed the archived case of Sofia Castillo and her husband, the brilliant lawyer Alejandro, who had vanished without a trace. The pieces began to fit together in her mind, forming the profile of a man broken by the very system she fought to fix every day. While Vega assembled her puzzle, Alejandro focused on his next target, the judge who had laughed at his pain. This time, the operation was more sophisticated. He used his skills to trace the judge's illicit financial transactions, compiling a new dossier on his vast fortune hidden in tax havens. Days before acting, he anonymously leaked all the information to the international press. The judge's reputation was destroyed before his life even ended. Alejandro wanted to strip him of everything he valued, his status, his manufactured honor, before taking his last breath. Vengeance, he had learned, was a dish best served in courses, each one more bitter than the last. The judge's death was a macabre work of art. He was found in his luxurious office, dressed in his robes, sitting in his leather chair. In his hands, Alejandro had placed an old bronze scale. One of its pans weighed down heavily by a wad of blood-soaked dollars. The symbolism was unmistakable and resonated throughout the nation. The Justicar was not a brutal vigilante, he was a poet of punishment, and the city, starved for justice, began to devour his narrative. The corrupt elite panicked, while ordinary citizens celebrated in the streets. Alejandro had become a catalyst, a force of nature exposing the hypocrisy of power. For Detective Vega, the unbalanced scale was the final confirmation. The theatricality, the legal precision, the direct connection to Sofia Castillo's case. She knew with an uncomfortable certainty who her target was. Pursuing Alejandro was not like hunting an ordinary criminal. It was like chasing a ghost of her own frustration, a man doing the dirty work that the system prevented her from doing. She felt the pressure from her superiors, many of whom were secretly terrified of being next on the Justicar's list. Vega was in an impossible position, bound by law to arrest the only man who was effectively cleaning up the city. The figure of the Justicar became a phenomenon. Graffiti with the symbol of the unbalanced scale began to appear on the walls of the poorest neighborhoods. He was a folk saint for the dispossessed, an avenging angel for those the system had forgotten. Alejandro watched this growing cult from his shadowy lair, feeling a profound discomfort. He never wanted to be a hero. His was a path of personal damnation, a solitary journey into hell. The hope he saw in the eyes of the people in TV reports was a heavier burden than any of his crimes, a reminder of the idealism he had lost forever, now distortedly reflected back at him. It's a heavy burden, to see hope in the eyes of those who have nothing left, who see a beacon in your desperate acts. This fight against injustice, this thirst for a world where the scales don't always tip in favor of the powerful, is something that consumes the soul. If stories like this, which expose this visceral struggle, are important to you, your subscription to the channel gives us the strength and reach to continue bringing these accounts to light. Every voice that joins ours is another step away from the silence that allows monsters to thrive. Your help is crucial, so that this message is not lost. Unable to bear the weight of his new identity alone, Alejandro sought out the only fragment of his past he still trusted, Father Mateo. He found him in the small parish of his childhood, an oasis of silence amidst the chaos of Iztapalapa. Under the sad gaze of a wooden crucifix, Alejandro confessed, not the murders, but the loss of his soul. He did not seek absolution, for he knew his sins were beyond forgiveness. He sought a witness, someone who could remember the man he had been before. The darkness consumed him completely, a final link to his humanity. Father Mateo listened with an infinite sadness in his tired eyes. He offered neither condemnation nor easy comfort. Instead, he questioned. He spoke of Sophia, of her faith in truth and light, and asked Alejandro if the darkness he now wielded truly honored her memory. "You are hunting monsters, my son, but be careful not to become one in the process. What justice will there be in the world if, to achieve it, we destroy the goodness left within ourselves?" The priest's words were like stones, sinking slowly into the well of rage and pain that Alejandro's heart had become. Alejandro's torment intensified when he saw Elena, Sophia's younger sister, on a national news broadcast. Now, a young journalism student, she spoke with the same fiery passion as her sister, but her words were a condemnation. She denounced the Justicar, calling him a murderer hiding behind a false cause, arguing that violence only begets more violence, and that his methods were a desecration of true justice. Seeing the suffering and conviction on Elena's face, so much like Sophia's, was a physical blow to Alejandro. He was protecting his identity from her to spare her, but his actions were hurting her in a way he had not foreseen. The nights became a battlefield for his mind. Dreams of Sophia, once a refuge of warmth and happiness, were now feverish nightmares. He saw her in his dreams, but her face was always disapproving, her eyes filled with sadness. Sometimes he relived the night of her death, but in his dreams he was the one holding the gun. He would wake up in a cold sweat, a scream trapped in his throat. Father Mateo's question and Elena's condemnation echoed in his head. Was he becoming the kind of man Sophia would despise? Vengeance was emptying him, leaving behind only the shell of a man driven by an unabating hatred. Despite his internal turmoil, the mission continued. The next target was a businessman named Marco Ribeiro, the cartel's primary money launderer, a man who turned the blood of the streets into luxury real estate and stock market shares. Taking him down required more than brute force. It required the cunning of the lawyer Alejandro used to be. He infiltrated Ribeiro's company security system, planting false evidence that incriminated him to his own cartel bosses. He played his enemies against each other, creating calculated chaos. Ribeiro's fall would be from the inside out, an implosion of his own greed and paranoia, orchestrated by Alejandro's invisible hands. Ribeiro's execution was almost an anticlimax. After being betrayed by the cartel, the businessman was left to die by his former allies. Alejandro simply found him, a broken and abandoned man, in one of his warehouses. There was no fight, only the empty gaze of a man who had already lost everything. Alejandro felt a profound weariness, a nausea with the carnage. The satisfaction from before was gone, replaced by a grey emptiness. Each death pushed him further from Sophia, further from the man she loved. He was winning the war, but with each victory he felt he lost a larger piece of himself, and he feared that soon there would be nothing left to save. Across the city, in the palaces of power and crime, the reaction was different. Senator Javier Montenegro was terrified. The Justicar was moving up the food chain, and the senator knew his connection to the cartel made him a prime target. He used his influence to demand the Vigilante's capture. In contrast, Ricardo El Halcón Morales, the leader of the Los Cuervos cartel, was more annoyed than afraid. He saw the Justicar not as an existential threat, but as an insult to his authority, a rabid dog that needed to be put down. He mobilized his sicarios not only to protect the remaining targets, but to actively hunt the hunter. Isabella Vega's hunt finally bore fruit. A minuscule error by Alejandro, a signal reflection from one of his devices during the infiltration of Ribeiro's servers, left an infinitesimal digital trail. To any other officer, it would be invisible, but for Vega, it was Ariadne's thread. She followed it with relentless tenacity, and the trail led her dangerously close to Alejandro's hideout in Iztapalapa. The noose was tightening. Alejandro, always monitoring police communications, knew she was getting close. He was trapped between the law, represented by Vega, and chaos, personified by El Halcon. The confrontation was inevitable. Vega, acting alone and against protocol, cornered Alejandro, not in his lair, but on neutral ground, the old library in the city center, a place of silence and knowledge. With no weapon drawn, she approached him between the dusty bookshelves. She called him by his name. Alejandro! The sound of his real name, spoken aloud by someone else, hit him like an electric shock. For an instant, the Justicar vanished, and the lost lawyer found himself exposed under the dim library lights. It didn't run. He faced her, and in her gaze he saw not just a cop, but a soul equally tired of the same war. Their conversation was a duel of convictions, whispered among the shelves of forgotten stories. "I know what they took from you," Vega said, her voice firm, but with a hint of empathy. "But what you're doing isn't justice. It's an abyss, and it's looking back at you." Alejandro responded in a hoarse, lifeless voice. "Justice is a luxury for those the system protects, detective. For the rest of us, all that's left is retribution." They were reflections of each other in a broken mirror, both fighting the same evil, but divided by the thin line of the law. She warned him that she could no longer ignore his actions, that she would arrest him. After the encounter with Vega, Alejandro found himself at a crossroads. He could disappear, accept that he had gone far enough, and flee with the ghosts that haunted him. Or he could see it through to the end, cut off the serpent's head, knowing he likely wouldn't survive. Looking at the map on his wall, at the faces of Montenegro and El Halcon, he felt Sophia's gaze upon him. To flee would be to betray her memory, to leave her death without the final punctuation it deserved. The hesitation dissolved, replaced by a steely resolve. He would not back down. He would escalate the conflict, force a checkmate, no matter the personal cost. It was then that the decisive action took shape in his mind. He would no longer hunt them in the shadows. He would drag them into the light. Senator Montenegro was hosting his grand annual charity ball, a gala event for the city's elite, broadcast live across the country. It would be the perfect stage. There, amidst the glitter of hypocrisy, Alejandro would perform his final act. He wouldn't just kill the senator, he would destroy him publicly, exposing every one of his crimes for the world to see, using the senator's own media as his weapon. This would be his final judgment, a sentence broadcast live, where the entire nation would be the jury. The preparation for the final act consumed every second of his existence. He turned the warehouse into a workshop, building the devices needed to hack the event's broadcast and infiltrate the impenetrable security. Every step was meticulously planned, every contingency considered. He knew it would be a suicide mission. Before leaving, he paid one last visit to Father Mateo's parish, not to confess, but to say goodbye. He left the priest a package containing all of Sophia's original evidence and his own, with instructions to release it if he did not return. It was his insurance policy for the truth. On the eve of the gala, as he was making his final preparations, one of his underworld contacts sent him an urgent encrypted message. El Halcon, anticipating a move against Montenegro, was not waiting to be the prey. He had made his own preemptive move, a cruel and personal play to take the Justicar out of the game. He had kidnapped the only person Alejandro had left in the world, the only person he had sworn to protect from a distance. Elena. Alejandro's plan, his grand opera of vengeance, had just turned into a deadly trap, and he was walking straight into it. The luxury hotel ballroom was a pit of glittering hypocrisy, where the city's wolves dressed in sheep's clothing to celebrate their own greed under the guise of charity. Alejandro moved among them like a spectre, the darkness in his soul a stark contrast to the brilliance of the crystal chandeliers. His plan was in motion, his nerves taut like steel cables. It was then that his phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. The image that appeared on the screen froze the blood in his veins. Elena, gagged and tied to a chair, her face bruised. Then a text message, the address of a warehouse in the Port District. "Abandon your puppet show and come alone, or the girl joins her sister." The trap was set. In that instant, Alejandro's universe contracted into an impossible choice. On one side, the culmination of his revenge, the promise made over Sophia's grave. On the other, the last spark of family he had left, the last living connection to the man he had been. The images of Sophia and Elena merged in his mind, both victims of the same monsters. To sacrifice Elena to complete the mission would be the final desecration of Sophia's memory, the act that would irrevocably turn him into the same kind of creature he hunted. A clarity emerged from the chaos. He would not choose. He would do both. He activated his system's final protocol. In 10 minutes, the digital attack would begin, with or without him. Sophia's truth would come out. His humanity, however, he would have to rescue himself. As Senator Montenegro took the podium, his smiling, charismatic face filling the giant screens in the ballroom, Alejandro gave the command. The senator's image flickered, distorted, and was replaced by a stream of incriminating data. Bank statements from Cayman Islands accounts, photos of Montenegro in secret meetings with El Halcon, and the clear audio of a conversation where he authorized Sophia's accident. The hall fell into a shocked silence, followed by a pandemonium of screams and camera flashes. The career, the life, and the lie of Javier Montenegro were publicly executed in real time. Hidden in the shadows near an exit, Alejandro watched the implosion for a second, a somber nod to Sophia, before turning and running towards the darkness. Towards Elena. The warehouse reeked of rotten fish and salt water. El Halcon was waiting for him in the center of a circle of light, savoring the moment. Elena was there, just like in the photo, terror in her eyes. The cartel leader was no mere thug. He was a sadistic director in his own play. He clapped slowly as Alejandro arrived. "Bravo, lawyer. What a show. You destroyed my business partner, but vengeance is a two-player game." He gestured toward Elena. "I took your wife. Now I'll take her. Sister. And then I'll take your life. You are not justice. You are just a dead man with a to-do list." Psychological warfare was his preferred weapon, and he drove it deep into Alejandro's wound. The violence erupted without warning. Alejandro did not respond with words, but with action. He threw himself into the darkness surrounding the circle of light, using stacks of crates for cover. El Halcon's men opened fire, bullets tearing through wood and ricocheting off metal. Alejandro's months of training, his discipline, and his channeled rage took over. He moved with a lethal economy, appearing and disappearing in the shadows, turning the environment into his weapon. One by one, the sicarios fell, victims of the brutal precision of a man with nothing left to lose. A bullet grazed his side, a burning pain he ignored, the fire of adrenaline and the need to save Elena burning hotter. Finally, only the two of them remained, circling each other under the single swinging bulb, casting dancing shadows. Alejandro and El Halcon, the lawyer and the monster. The fight was savage, stripped of any art or technique. It was a confrontation of pure hatred. El Halcon was stronger, a predator accustomed to physical violence, but Alejandro was driven by something more primal. He was the personification of the pain and loss of countless victims. Every punch he threw was for Sophia. Every blow he absorbed was for the city El Halcon had poisoned. Using his intellect, Alejandro lured him to an unstable area of the floor, which gave way under the cartel leader's weight, giving him the opening he needed. In a final, desperate effort, gravely wounded and bleeding, Alejandro managed to overpower El Halcon. The cartel leader's death was not clean. It was a visceral, intimate act, life draining from his eyes as Alejandro held him, ensuring the last face he saw was that of the man whose life he had destroyed. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and Elena's muffled sobs. He stumbled towards her, cutting her bonds with trembling hands. He had saved her. He had fulfilled his promise. But as he looked at the blood on his hands, the blood of so many men, he knew he had lost himself in the process. His vengeance was complete, but the victory was only ashes. With El Halcon's life draining onto the filthy warehouse floor, Alejandro leaned on Elena, his strength depleting with every drop of blood that left his body. He guided her out of that hell into the cold night air. There, under the dim light of a street lamp, he faced her, the last vestige of his old world. There were no words that could explain the journey that had brought him here. "They can't find you with me," he whispered, his voice hoarse with pain and exhaustion. He made her promise she would live, that she would continue Sophia's work, but the right way. It was a silent farewell, a goodbye to everything he had ever loved. Then, like a ghost, he dissolved into the darkness of an alley, leaving her safe, but forever marked by the truth of his vengeance. The sirens grew from a distant wail to a deafening howl. Detective Isabella Vega was the first to arrive, her car screeching to a halt at the warehouse entrance. She found Elena, shocked and trembling, and the scene of carnage inside. The body of Ricardo El Halcon Morales, the man who had haunted the city for a decade, lay lifeless. For the police, it was a victory. For Vega, it was the conclusion of a tragedy. Her trained eyes followed the trail of blood, leading away from the epicenter of the violence, a scarlet path that told the story of the Justicar's desperate escape. Her duty was clear: follow the trail, corner her prey, and make the arrest that would close the most infamous case of her career. Standing at the warehouse exit, her radio crackling on her shoulder, Vega stared into the dark alley where the blood trail disappeared. She thought of the scales of justice, the same ones Alejandro had used as his symbol, a scale that she knew was permanently unbalanced. To arrest Alejandro would be to arrest the symptom of the disease, not the cure. In an act of silent understanding, a rebellion against the broken system they both fought, she made her decision. She keyed her radio and reported the scene, listing the dead cartel members. When the dispatcher asked about the Justicar's whereabouts, she paused, then said, "He's not here. It looks like the cartel tore itself apart." She clicked the radio off, allowing the ghost of justice to vanish into the night. In the weeks that followed, Mexico City changed. Senator Montenegro's exposure triggered the largest political scandal in the country's history, resulting in dozens of arrests and the promise of systemic reform. El Halcon's death left the Los Cuervos cartel decapitated, plunging the underworld into an internal war that, paradoxically, made the streets safer for the average citizen. The Justicar was never seen again. To the city, he became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of power and a myth of hope for the oppressed. Alejandro Castillo's vengeance was complete. He had cleansed the city, but at a terrible cost, leaving behind an ambiguous legacy and the eternal question, is justice achieved through blood truly justice at all? Alejandro's journey forces us to confront what we would do if the system we believe in abandoned us. He achieved his retribution, but lost himself in the abyss, a sacrifice that blurs the lines between hero and monster. Stories like his are a mirror for our own thirst for justice and the limits of our humanity. If you believe that narratives like this need to be told, that these difficult questions need to be explored, I ask you to subscribe. Your subscription helps us continue to be a voice for the voiceless, ensuring the echo of these struggles never fades. Alejandro's fate remains unknown, a ghost wandering the scars of a city he both saved and destroyed.